you're an athlete or if you're anybody that's training hybrid at all, have you ever run into the issue of trying to fit everything into 1 week or even 2 weeks, trying to fit in all your program, trying to do everything? Maybe you're doing CrossFit class and you're still trying to fit in all this additional stuff, right? You're trying to fit in your accessory work, you're trying to fit in your Olympic lifting work, you're trying to fit in your cardio and your aerobic work, and it can be really difficult to fit all of that in. Or if you're just a bodybuilder, you're anybody that's training hybrid can be difficult because one of the main things about training hybrid is trying to have a strong aerobic capacity while remaining strong, while keeping some kind of muscle mass, and really essentially being good at everything else, or as best as we possibly can be, as best as my physiology will allow. And it can be really tough because aerobic work is very, very important. And a lot of folks do misunderstand aerobic work. They maybe think that they're getting aerobic work when they're doing their CrossFit workouts, when CrossFit workouts typically are not aerobic in nature. There's really not enough time. So to keep it really short, if you want to move the needle, if you want to have better cardio, if you want to have better endurance, to put it very simple, you're going to have to allot a certain amount of time each week for that aerobic work. The thing about aerobic work is it does take time, just like anything else. Just like strength work, you've got to put in the time for the years. Same thing with aerobic work, you've got to put in the time. And ideally, aerobic work, when we talk aerobic work, we're talking, somewhere about zone 2 heart rate. And you are doing that for a long duration of time, meaning 40 minutes plus, ideally. Now, one could argue that maybe you get some kind of benefits for 30 minutes, but really 40 minutes or and beyond is when you really start to see in one session where you start to see you get the most bang for your buck out of doing that aerobic work. So if I'm doing an aerobic session, I really try to keep it to 40 minutes plus. That's not to say that if you just don't have time that you shouldn't do 20 minutes or 30 minutes here or there. I do think that it's beneficial. So don't just throw that out and not do the aerobic work at all just because you don't have the time. But ideally, you're going to fit in, 40 minutes plus of aerobic work. Now, that can be tough to do that multiple times when you are trying to be hybrid. You're trying to be good at all the stuff. You're trying to fit in all your accessory work. Well, I have really, really good news for you because you can incorporate a lot of your accessory work into your session, into your aerobic session without going anaerobic, without flipping that switch. So this is really, really great news, and I'm going to walk through that. Now, I do have another video that I'm going to link here that goes through one of my actual workouts, one of my high rocks aerobic workouts that I do, and I try to stay in that zone 2. Sometimes a zone 3 heart rate at most for me, and stay in that aerobic zone, that conversational pace where I did one of those workouts today, and I did a partner workout with my high rocks partner, and I talked through the entire session. Out of breath the whole time, but talk the whole time, was never out of control. So let's walk through that and break that down just a little bit. So with that, with adding in these accessory movements, the key isn't just heart rate, it's managing muscle fatigue or local muscle fatigue and systemic oxygen demand. Let's talk a little bit about the physiology of aerobic lifting. So your body doesn't switch from aerobic to anaerobic, like a switch, right? It's a sliding scale. Let's say, for example, we're adding in a heavy sled push. When you push that heavy sled, you're going to be working those type 2 muscle fibers, generating a high amount of power. And essentially, the problem is that these fibers can produce more lactate. Essentially, to try to keep that workout more aerobic, we've got to make sure that our oxidative system, that our body can clear that lactate faster than it's producing. And that's ultimately the key to managing. Number one, I talked about having a conversational pace, being able to hold a conversation. And that's one of the great tests that you can use to make sure that you're keeping at a good pace. I always do put on a heart rate monitor, but sometimes those other movements can be a little bit deceiving. So we want to make sure that, like, when you come off, let's say, and I do incorporate a sled push into my long aerobic, 1 day a week of long aerobic work. It's like my GPP, my general physical preparedness slash high rock slash aerobic day. I'm doing a lot in that workout. But what I make sure is that when you come off the sled, that you could still have a conversation with somebody. You're not going to push that sled to the point where you're gasping for air and you couldn't have a conversation with somebody. So that's one test to make sure that you're staying in the right zone. Don't push the sled further, don't push the sled so far that you get so out of breath that you couldn't talk to somebody, or you're feeling this massive, massive burn in your legs. You definitely don't want that on these training days. So you can change the stimulus up to what you need, right? So if you need to work on pushing a sled with 8 plates on it, and you can push it for 25 foot, but it doesn't get you out of breath that bad, it doesn't really build up a bunch of fatigue in your legs, then just do 25 foot at a time and mix that in with different activities. So maybe you're doing the Concept 2 bike for 500 meters, and then you're getting on that sled and you're just pushing that sled for 25 foot, and it's not really blowing you up, but you're getting practice on the sled, you're getting some power output, you're getting and you're staying in that aerobic zone. So you're really killing two birds with one stone. What I like to do, and you'll see this how I structure my workouts, you also, the second kind of thing that you want to incorporate in is a flush period. You want that flush period. So this is something I use. This is something I use a lot for this type of workout, where maybe you'll do that sled push, you'll push, and then you need, like I said, that 500-meter uh, Concept 2 bike to like regulate your heart rate, to bring that heart rate back down a little bit. A lot of times a sled push, it'll feel like it gets your heart rate up, but it really just it builds up blood pressure, and it really gets that heart thumping. But it's not really making your heart rate go through the roof unless you stay in that for too long, right? So like, you just do a 25 foot or a 50 foot, and you can gauge that depending on your level of fitness, what you're trying to work on. I mean, you could drop the weight down and do a longer push, or you could bring the weight up and do a shorter push. But the main thing is you got to stay in that aerobic zone. And you really got to be careful. You don't want to start pushing out of that aerobic zone on that sliding scale and moving more towards intensity and moving more towards going anaerobic. Because once you go too anaerobic, it's going to be really hard to bring that workout back to where you're really getting the most bang for your buck during that time working on the aerobic system. So what I would try to do is really at the beginning of that workout, if it's going to be an hour long, try to have exercises that really are hard to go anaerobic on in the beginning, and then as the workout move, if you're not experienced, if you're experienced, you're going to know how to control this. But if you're not experienced, keep the bike, the ski, the row, walking or jogging or whatever in the beginning of that workout, and then at the end maybe bring in some of the sled pushes and things like that maybe might put you more anaerobic. That way you don't mess up and quote unquote not ruin your workout, but kind of mess your workout up by going too anaerobic going anaerobic accidentally too soon. Having that flush period, whether it be an easy bike or a walk or something like that, is gonna be great to be able to flush out any of that lactate that maybe may build up, and make sure to keep that heart regulated. Now, I think sled pushes in general, I think are a cheat code to aerobic strength, because the sled push is fantastic, and the reverse sled drag, because there is no eccentric to the movement. So you're able to push and generate that concentric force, which is fantastic for a hybrid athlete. It's such a great tool, really, for any athlete in general to be able to go get in the work, go put in the work, do some. I mean, sled pushing is strength work uh, without muscle damage, without a lot of muscular damage, without a lot of nervous system fatigue. You can regulate it really well, like I said, with the distances and the weights. And it's just, to me, it's a cheat code of building that aerobic strength because of that lack of an eccentric. You couldn't do the same thing on, say, a back squat. If I was going to try to do back squats within an aerobic workout, sure, maybe I could do the back squats and keep them aerobic, but I'm going to have a lot of eccentric damage. I'm going to have some muscle damage and things that may interfere and have an interference effect with my run, or it may have an interference effect with my programming throughout the week or whatever. And sled pushes, man, they are a cheat code to be able to get in that power work without having any damage. And the name of the game with being a hybrid athlete, right, is being able to get the stimulus and recover, get the stimulus and still train the next day. And that's what sled push and sled drag does. Another rule of thumb, if you're watching a heart rate monitor, and let's say you have your heart rate monitor on and you're in that zone 2 heart rate, and then you go push the sled and it jumps you up into a high zone 3 right away from a zone 2, well, maybe that sled is too heavy, or maybe the distance was too far and you can back it off. So again, going back to making sure that you don't go anaerobic, it's really important to don't begin to build up the acid. You don't begin to have that acidosis. If you push that set to failure, if you push that sled too hard, acidosis is going to occur. Acidity in the blood can inhibit those aerobic enzymes from working efficiently, from working properly, or working as much as you want them to. So again, going back to that, you just have to make sure that you're not pushing. You can't push into that anaerobic zone, right? You can't start to build up that acid in your muscles in whatever you do. You got to be real careful of that. Another rule of thumb, you should never really feel the pump or the burn. Like once the burn once you start to feel the burn, you should just stop. You should never go into that point, because you're gonna start to build up that acidity in the blood. So, for example, if I'm doing, like, I'll incorporate in a lot of different accessory work into this aerobic day. I'll do sled pushes, I'll do reverse sled drags, I will do farmer's carries or some sort of carry. I will do like a D-ball carry, a bear hug carry. I will do Sometimes I'll even do like, or I will do overhead carries to work on overhead stability. I'll do that, but every single one of those exercises I'm not doing to the point where I'm starting to really feel that burn and that fatigue. As soon as that burn starts to set in, set them down, and then I'll do a flushing activity. So the way I like to kind of line them up is according to muscle group. So for example, if I'm doing a sled push, I'll come off the sled push and go into a light jog, or even when I was less fit, maybe a walk, and then, or like an uphill walk, and then to clear and flush that little bit of acidity out, a little bit of lactate out, clear that out, and get my heart rate, get everything back to baseline. And then, after doing a dumbbell overhead carry, I'll go into a movement like the ski where I'm using my shoulders and I'm using my lats, and I'll try to do a more arm dominant flushing after doing that overhead carry to help increase local muscle endurance. After doing a farmer's carry, I will do a row. So then on the row, I'm kind of I'm pulling, and I'm using my grip, and I'm pulling. So I mean, and I try to incorporate those that way too. So whatever movement is kind of, whatever muscle is is maybe getting a little bit of burn stimulus, I'm I'm using the next movement to flush it. So if I'm doing legs, I'm using I'm flushing with a leg movement. If I'm using my arms, I'm flushing with an arm movement. Try to do it that way. I think another key thing to keep in mind, I gave you the conversational test. Make sure you're at a conversational pace. Another thing could be RPE, rate of perceived effort. If you're putting that on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being an all out race day max effort, 1 being easy walk in the park, you probably want to be somewhere around a 5 or a 6 RPE as well. So that's another good way to gauge it. So you can incorporate these in, and it makes aerobic work really fun, because now, you're, a lot of times I'll do it in sections. I'll do AMRAPs. So I'll do, like, okay, I'm going to do 18 minutes of work with these 4 movements. Then I'll rest 2 minutes, do 18 minutes of work with these 4 movements, rest 2 minutes, 18 minutes of work with these 4 movements. And, and maybe I start that progression doing just 10-minute, 3 rounds of 10 minutes, and then 3 rounds of 11 minutes, 3 rounds of 12 minutes, 3 rounds of 13. And then you build up to where you're doing, a whole hour and a half of work. But it's great because when you're doing, maybe 10 different movements, and you're incorporating in all these low, low impact, no eccentric, low muscle stress exercises, when you incorporate in like 10 different exercises, it makes it so much easier to go in the gym and do an hour or an hour and a half of aerobic work versus just sitting there on the bike. Uh, if you're biking inside, and I realize biking outdoors could be great, but yeah, but you're also not as in control if you live in a hilly environment like I live in. You're going to encounter hills, which are going to spike the heart rate and things like that. But for me, that is how I approach uh, building the ability to build strength and fit all my accessory work into an aerobic session. And I just don't see a lot of people doing this, having a GPP and accessory aerobic day. And to me, it is so time efficient. You get so much bang for your buck. And I understand you just have to do it correctly. It can be really easy. Like today, my partner that I was working out with, was pushing, was really saying they were starting to feel a burn in their legs and the sled. And I was like, whoa, back off. Don't push the sled that far. Let's cut that distance down in half. Let's ease that off. We don't want to build up too much, fatigue in the legs. And so it can be a little tricky. So I get why maybe some people don't do it, but man, to me, it is just a fantastic way uh, for somebody who's busy to be able to fit everything into one session. Tell me what you think. What do you think about that? Do you think that it's stupid? Do you think that there's too much possibility for, going to an aerobic within that type of session? Do you like doing that? Do you do that yourself? Or are you going to give it a try? Questions, comments. I know sometimes this type of thing can be a little bit tough to figure out until you actually go do it and see what it feels like. But yeah, would love to hear any questions, comments, concerns, anything you have like that. And as always, thank you so much for your time. If this video was helpful, please hit that like button. And I hope to see you again in another video.